The club scene. Oh, the club scene. The scene that I believe catapulted the show to the phenomenon that it is today. Tierney deserves an award just for that minute to minute and a half sequence, playing to, of course, the slow down reverb version of All the Things She Said that was remixed and redone by Harrison. Others are still at the cottage. Girl, I am still at the club, okay? I am in the corner watching you kiss her. Oh, 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 oh. That scene was absolutely brilliant. And I think Jacob Tierney brought a bit of himself as a gay man to that particular sequence, right? In the book, that sequence didn't carry the emotional brevity and weight that it does in the TV show. And again, I think part of that has to do with the power of, cinematic and televisual aesthetics, color, lighting, the music, and all of that. Tierney created something very magical in that moment. And again, I think as a gay man, he brought his lived experience because, girl, what gay man or what queer person hasn't been traumatized on the dance floor. You know what I mean? Like, that's what happens. You come out of the closet, you go out to the dance floor, and you become traumatized. And, it's almost like a rebirthing, right? It's this, you don't just come out of the closet. That's a type of rebirth. But I think you go out onto the dance floor to become alive, right? You put the queer body, the gay body on display. You let go of all of the pressure that you put on yourself, all of the surveillance that you put yourself on of having to talk a certain way or walk a certain way. You're on the dance floor, you're feeling good, you're letting it out, you're coming alive, you are being born, again. But of course, as we know, if you are born, that also means that you are mortal and you have the opportunity to perish and perish on the dance floor. So it's a rite of passage, right? I mean, who hasn't been traumatized on the dance floor? And again, I think Jacob Tierney has. I know I have. I think we all have. And I think he brought that to that sequence and to the show. And we are all better off for it. And I still think that all of us are still to this moment. We've left at least a small part of ourselves still on that dance floor. In fact, upon some reflection, I realized that the feelings that I had about this sequence is something that was a bit uncanny. It reminded me of a set of feelings that I had watching another queer Canadian piece of representation, this time a movie, where it features a sequence of two individuals looking at their object of desire with lust, with awe, with fear, with anxiety. And I'm talking, of course, about Xavier Dolan's movie Les Amours Imaginaires, which was released in 2010, but whose English title is Heartbeats. So in that movie, it tells the story of two friends, one man, one woman, who are similarly have a similar attraction to an individual, a guy. And there is a sequence that happens in the middle of a movie at a house party where the two are sitting on the couch and they can't help but just stare into oblivion as they watch, the object of their shared desire dance and have fun. Of course, he is dancing with somebody else. Now, to the extent that their looks are focused on a sense of envy that they're not there with that person dancing with them, or that they're dancing with someone else, is subject to interpretation. But I remember feeling something very similar. This, you have those cinematic moments. What Roland Barthes might call like the puncture or the punctum, where it just something penetrates through the screen and what becomes artifice becomes real, and just, struck me and I felt something very strongly. So, and I don't think it's unsurprising that the movie is set in Montreal and was made by a Montreal filmmaker, and of course Jacob Tierney himself is, a Montrealer as well, and he's been making, TV shows and movies for a very long time. He's worked with a lot of Canadian, a lot of Quebecois and Montreal actors as well. So undoubtedly, he's seen Les Amours Imaginaires, knows Xavier Dolan, and this could very well also be either a reference to that movie or he may have taken inspiration from that movie. But if you haven't seen Les Amours Imaginaires, I definitely recommend that you go out and see it. So the dance floor for queer people has traditionally been such an important and oftentimes contested space for gay and for queer people, right? It's where we go to find other like-minded individuals, and it's where we go to be free. But of course, that sense of freedom is also laced by danger, right? The danger of rejection, the danger of not fitting in, and of course, there are actual physical dangers of, you know, someone slipping you something and being harmed in that way. So the dance floor is a very contentious space. And it's an odd space as well, just because it is where you go to kind of almost be free and be yourself, and yet it's very dark, it's very loud, it's anonymous, it's all designed to depersonalize you, which is odd just because you're going there to be, in some respects, your individual self. But the depersonalization almost supports this idea of putting people on equal footing and creating this sense of almost community of the same person and same bodies interacting with one another. But of course, again, that can result in some interesting opportunities to meet new people, to find lovers, but also there are you know, the I don't want to say dangerous, but the risks that can be involved in putting yourself out there in that way. And in this instance, I mean more emotional and social rather than, than physical. But I've been talking for the last, what, 5 minutes or so, and I haven't talked about the changes between the books and the TV show, so I should probably get to that. So, all of this is to say that one of the changes that really struck me was that in the book, Ilya is talking when Ilya invites the girl that he's dancing with, back to his place or to engage in something further. She essentially says, "Actually, I have a boyfriend," which throws Ilya off a bit, and it also threw me off. I'm like, "Oh, that was interesting." But in the TV show, Ilya is seen, going home and taking a shower, which is intercut with enjoying a shower, and is intercut with scenes of Shane, having sex with his, I guess, girlfriend or pseudo girlfriend, Rose. And it takes on a very different meaning in the TV show, that juxtaposition and that intercutting of these two sexual activities that seeks to bind these two individuals together. Whereas in the book, it wasn't as literary or as symbolic, because again in the book, it just turns out that the girl had a boyfriend, and so Ilya just ends up going home on his own because he kind of, I guess you could say, struck out. Another sequence that captivated audiences and propelled Connor's story to the rarefied circle of Emmy contention, despite not actually being qualified for an Emmy because it is a full Canadian production and not a co-production, was the sequence where Ilya delivers his very beautiful, very emotional, very poetic and lyrical monologue, or even, soliloquy, if you will, to Shane entirely in Russian over the phone. So in the book, though, it's again similar to the club scene. The conversation between the two did not carry the same sort of weight and brevity, and that's actually in part because that speech was written entirely by Jacob Tierney. That speech that Connor's story delivered is not in the book at all. In fact, in the book, what you end up getting is a bit of a summary, but one that is largely told from Shane's perspective, and that really just focuses on Shane, enjoying the sound of Ilya's voice and the sense of freedom that Ilya is experiencing, not being restricted, by having to translate everything from Russian into English. And I'm just going to read you a quote that kind of summarizes what I mean by this. So it's on page 20, on 224, and he says, "Without the ability to translate any of it, Shane could just enjoy the sound of Ilya's voice, which he barely recognized now. The words were so quick and confident, unrestricted by Ilya, having to carefully piece together his sentences like when he spoke in English. It felt intimate, like they were somehow sharing a bigger secret now than when they were sleeping together." Um, so it's only afterwards in it's only afterwards in a separate scene where Ilya is grabbing a coffee at a coffee shop where he's thinking about what he told Shane that we actually get a bit of insight into the specifics of what he said. And that happens on page 226. And I'm just going to read you something from there just so you can see what I mean. So he says here, well, it says in the book, mostly he had just been ranting about his family, but he had included an admission that he wished things could have been different with his father. That admission would have been embarrassing enough, but Ilya also slipped in and on top of everything, I'm pretty sure I'm in love with you and I don't know what to do about it. So that's the extent of the monologue or soliloquy that Ilya delivered to Shane. Of course, in the show, it's I think 2 to 3 minutes. It's entirely in Russian, and you know he confesses basically all of his feelings, and we get to hear all of that, and it creates this really strong bond. I would say between us, the viewers, and the character of Ilya, and I think it's that moment where that sort of tough guy, you know, that sarcasm as a shield, that comedic edge, him being a bit of a butthole, um, all of these things start to melt away, and we start to see him really coming out of his shell, confessing his feelings, that sensitivity, the vulnerability, and that's where we really create that really strong connection with Ilya. Whereas I think in a lot of the show up until that point, our our allegiance and our identification to some degree might be largely with Shane because he is showing more of that vulnerability and those feelings, even though we can sense that from Ilya, you know, that tough guy persona. But this is really the moment where all of that melts away and we're given access to that intimacy. And it's again just really, really beautifully done, really beautifully delivered, and Emmy worthy in every sense. But unfortunately, they'll just have to settle for every other award that exists and that they can be nominated for because, as I said before, unfortunately, the show and the people involved do not qualify for Emmy nominations. So, episode 5 is not only one of the best reviewed episodes of television in 2025, but it's actually one of the best reviewed episodes of television in the history of television. Of course, I think there's a little bit of like presentist bias that's at play there, but nonetheless, it is a spectacular episode. And what don't we get in that episode? We get this beautiful monologue that happens, in the backdrop against falling snow in that red tunnel that's covered in graffiti. We get this playful side of Ilya earlier on in Florida where Shane is watching Connor play with these kids and is very clearly thinking like, wow, this guy's great with kids. He's would be a really great father. And of course, I think it also plants the seed of what we see later on where they decide to open up that charity and that hockey camp, right? But of course, we also get, at the very end of the episode, that big rom-com coming out moment where Scott and Kit have that beautiful kiss in the arena out in public where the love is publicly declared, and of course then feeds into another really famous moment and really famous line at the very, very end of episode 5, which is, of course, I'm coming to the cottage. So episode 5 is spectacular on every level, and I think the evolution that we've seen with Ilya has been really heartwarming. And whereas with Shane, again, his character I think was changed quite a bit throughout the show, and Ilya's character really wasn't. This decision that Tierney made to change essentially Ilya's character by having him deliver that speech and giving us that access, I think was an absolutely brilliant executive decision, artistic decision. And it really stands out as one of the best moments in the show. And I think one of the best delivered monologues and one of the most heartfelt monologues delivered in the history of queer representation, film, television, or otherwise. Before I move on, I have to say that I don't think that the speech that Ilya delivers being set in a tunnel is insignificant, right? I think that it's loaded with a lot of meaning. On a literary level, it represents Ilya traversing and moving from one space to another, one emotional state to another, right? So from, not wanting to acknowledge his feelings to acknowledging his feelings, from being distant from Shane to being closer to Shane, right? I think there's a symbolic element as well in that it represents him leaving physically Russia and the symbolism of Russia, him being sad, him being lonely, this sort of patriarchal state that made him really unhappy, and moving towards North America, towards his future, towards Shane. That is also represented by, him being on the phone with Shane and Shane being, in a hotel room, in Buffalo. So there is that element as well that is captured in the tunnel because the tunnel is just that, right? It's a connective space that connects two different places and allows for a transition from one place um, to another, right? It's also a liminal space, which is similar to the hotel room. So it's this odd in between space that is, public, but also oddly private. It's enclosed, and so I think it's important that he's having this sort of private moment in this kind of semi-private, almost like womb-like space, right? Because it's red, and it's circular, it's enclosed. He's huddled sort of in the corner, almost in like this infantile state. It's providing him this protection from the cold. So there's a lot of symbolism in in that tunnel in terms of him, like I said, moving from one state emotionally and physically to another. And as I mentioned, on more abstract level, there is this womb-like entity. There is this womb-like symbolism to that space that's allowing him to come out to give birth, if you will, to a new version of himself. And continuing on that abstract thinking, because I love my abstract thinking, I would say that the tunnel is also kind of like a symbolic artery, that connects, bear with me now, the genitals and the heart, right? The hookups, you know, that the blood flows from there through the artery towards the heart, towards the cottage. The cottage, of course, is a physical space, and the hookups, the genitals, are represented by a physical space as well, the hotel space that are connected through this tunnel. Again, I don't think it's insignificant that Shane is currently at a hotel in a stairwell listening to this conversation. And so this tunnel really does have a multitude of meanings. And of course, as we know, later on in the episode, Shane is going to get a concussion. He's going to invite Ilya to the cottage, and the episode is going to end with him saying, "I'm coming to the cottage," whereby the very last part of the book, as well as the last episode in the series, is going to be in the physical space of the cottage, but is also, which also represents, the heart. It represents the heart, and I think that's really, really beautiful. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to geek out a little bit with my abstract theory. I'm curious to know what you think about that, or if you feel any differently, or if there's additional symbolic meaning that I might have missed.